1,000 steel pellets crushed their Banzai charge. Japanese soldiers were petrified with terror. Part 1. The Giant Shotgun. The Pacific Theater in 1943 was a place of primal terror. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, the Japanese army relied on a psychological weapon that had worked for decades, the Banzai charge. Thousands of men, screaming at the top of their lungs, would emerge from the darkness in a human wave. They believed that their Bushido spirit was impenetrable. They believed that no machine gun could stop the sheer momentum of 3,000 men charging with fixed bayonets. But as the Japanese surged toward the American lines, they didn't hear the rhythmic thud-thud of a machine gun. They heard a single earth-shattering crack. In an instant, the air wasn't filled with bullets. It was filled with a cloud of 150 steel balls, each the size of a marble, traveling at twice the speed of sound. It was the M2 canister round, fired from a 37mm anti-tank gun. To the Americans, it was a tactical necessity. To the Japanese survivors, it was the breath of the devil. The obsolete weapons knew life by 1943. The American 37mm anti-tank gun was becoming a joke against German tanks. Its shells simply bounced off the thick steel of a Panther or a Tiger. But in the Pacific, the Americans realized this obsolete gun had a terrifying new purpose. The Japanese didn't have many heavy tanks. Their greatest weapon was their infantry. So the Americans stopped loading armor-piercing shells and started loading canister. Inside the brass casing of a canister round sat a thin tin can filled with heavy steel pellets. There was no explosive in the shell itself. When the gun was fired, the tin can would disintegrate at the end of the barrel. The result was a giant shotgun, a cone of flying steel that expanded as it traveled. The math of 1,000 pellets. Imagine a single shotgun shell. Now imagine that shell is 3 times the size of a human fist. When an American crew pulled the lanyard on their 37mm gun, they weren't aiming at a single person. They were clearing a lane. At a range of 100 yards, the spread of the steel pellets was nearly 30 feet wide. One shot could take down an entire platoon. It didn't matter how fast you ran. It didn't matter how loudly you screamed. The steel pellets didn't miss. They shredded through uniforms, through equipment, and through the very trees of the jungle itself. The Japanese soldiers at the front of the charge didn't just fall. They were erased, petrified with terror. The psychological impact on the Japanese army was devastating. They were prepared to die for their emperor in a glorious bayonet fight. They were not prepared to be turned into a statistic by a weapon they couldn't even see. Japanese survivors of the Tenaru River and Henderson Field spoke of a weapon that felt like the hand of God, swiping across the battlefield. They would see their comrades disappear in a red mist, even though no one had fired a single machine gun. The Banzai charge, which had been the pride of the Japanese military, suddenly felt like a death trap. The soldiers began to hesitate. The spirit of the charge was being broken by the science of the canister round. They realized that spiritual courage meant nothing against 1,000 steel pellets moving at 1,500 miles per hour. The wall of silence after a canister shot was fired. The battlefield would often go deathly silent. The screaming would stop. The sound of charging boots would stop. There was only the sound of the brass shell casing hitting the jungle floor with a clink. The American crews would calmly reload another round, their eyes fixed on the darkness, waiting for the next wave. They didn't need to be snipers. They didn't need to be heroes. They just needed to be loaders for the most lethal shotgun ever built. The Japanese soldiers were petrified because they realized that the Americans weren't just fighting a war. They were harvesting the battlefield. A new kind of war. The canister round changed the Pacific War forever. It taught the Japanese that the human wave was no longer a viable tactic against American industrial firepower. As the war moved from island to island, the one boom of the 37mm gun became the signal that the Banzai charge was over. The wall of steel had arrived, and it was impenetrable. The pellets were small. but the terror was absolute. Part 2. The Meat Grinder. July 7, 1944. The island of Saipan. The Japanese army was facing total defeat, and their commanders decided on one final suicidal act of defiance. 3,000 Japanese soldiers, some armed only with bamboo spears, gathered for the largest Banzai charge of the Pacific War. To the American Marines waiting in the foxholes, the sound was like a rising tide of ghosts. Thousands of voices screaming 7 lives for the Emperor. But the Marines had a secret waiting in the tall grass. It wasn't just machine guns. It was the 75mm pack howitzer. And tonight, it wasn't firing at targets 5 miles away. It was pointed straight ahead, level with the ground, at a distance of less than 50 yards. The Japanese believed they were charging into glory. They were actually charging into a mechanical meat grinder that was about to turn the night air into a solid wall of flying lead. The flying lawnmower, the 75mm pack howitzer, was the Swiss Army knife of the Pacific. It was light enough to be broken down and carried by hand, but it carried a canister round that was twice the size of the 37mm. Inside a single 75mm canister shell sat nearly 350 steel balls. These weren't small pellets. They were heavy, solid steel spheres that functioned like a swarm of high-velocity hammers. When the lanyard was pulled, the gun didn't just fire. It inhaled. For a split second, the muzzle flash would illuminate the jungle, and then the wall of steel would launch forward. Marine veterans called it the flying lawnmower. It didn't just hit the enemy. It cut the battlefield. In one single blast, every blade of grass, every tree branch, and every human being in a 50-yard cone was instantly shredded. The no-man's land of steel. During the Great Charge on Saipan, the American artillerymen were working like machines. They didn't have time to aim. They didn't have time to pray. They just bore-sighted, looking straight through the barrel of the gun at the wave of Japanese soldiers. One boom, 350 pellets. The first wave of the Japanese charge simply disappeared. The soldiers behind them, blinded by the smoke and the flashes, kept running forward, only to trip over the bodies of their comrades and fall directly into the path of the next canister blast. The American crews were firing as fast as they could slam the shells into the breach. In some batteries, the barrels of the guns became so hot from the rapid canister fire that the paint began to blister and peel. The air smelled of burnt cordite and the metallic tang of blood. The Japanese weren't just being stopped. They were being processed by an industrial system of death. Petrified with terror, the Japanese soldiers who survived those first few seconds were truly petrified. In traditional combat, you can hide behind a tree or dive into a hole. But against a canister round from a 75, there is no cover. The steel pellets were heavy enough to punch through thick tropical timber. They would shatter the trees, sending jagged splinters of wood flying into the air like secondary shrapnel. Japanese survivors later wrote that it felt as if the Americans had invented a weapon that could turn the air itself into bullets. They couldn't understand how a single gun could kill 40 men in 1 second. The spiritual power they relied on was useless against a weapon that didn't care about their courage. They were frozen in place, watched their world literally disintegrate around them. The morning after, the silence of the steel when the sun finally rose over Saipan, the true power of the canister round was revealed. In front of the American gun positions, the ground was cleared of all vegetation for 100 yards. The Japanese soldiers lay in rows, exactly where the cones of fire had caught them. There was no heroic bayonet fight. There were only the remnants of a charge that had been broken by math and metal. The Marines who walked the field were silent. Even they were shocked by the surgical nature of the destruction. The 75mm gun had held the line when everything else seemed like it would fail. It had proven that no matter how many men you send, you cannot overcome a wall of steel, the final lesson of the grinder. The meat grinder was the final answer to the Banzai charge. From Saipan to Iwo Jima, the Japanese began to change their tactics. They stopped charging into the open because they knew the giant shotgun was waiting for them. The 75mm canister round didn't just win a battle. It changed the psychology of the war. It taught the enemy that American industrial power wasn't just about big planes and big ships. It was about the 350 steel pellets that could stop an empire in its tracks. The boom was the beginning. The steel was the end. Part 3. The 12-gauge tank. In the early days of 1942, in the steaming jungles of the Bataan Peninsula, the American M3 Stuart tanks were facing a nightmare. The Japanese infantry didn't fear the tank's armor. They would hide in the dense canopy, wait for the tanks to pass, and then swarm them like hornets, clutching satchel charges and anti-tank mines. The American tank crews were blind. Their machine guns couldn't hit targets hidden behind thick tropical teak and mahogany trees. They needed a weapon that could cleanse the jungle. They found that weapon in the 37mm canister round. Suddenly, the Me-3 Stuart wasn't just a light tank. It was a mobile armored 12-gauge shotgun. When a Japanese squad tried to rush the tank from the bushes, the crew didn't aim a single machine gun. They turned the entire turret and pulled the trigger on a wall of 150 steel pellets. The result was a total psychological collapse for the Japanese attackers. They weren't just being shot. They were being shredded by a machine that seemed to have no blind spots. The Sherman Sandpaper, by 1945, on the island of Okinawa, the scale of the wall of steel had grown even more terrifying. The Americans were now using the M4 Sherman, equipped with a 75mm gun. The Japanese had developed a new desperate tactic: human bullet attacks. Soldiers would hide in spider holes and jump onto the back of American tanks to place explosives on the engine deck. The American solution was as brutal as it was effective. It was called the sandpaper. If a Japanese soldier managed to climb onto a Sherman tank, the wingman tank, the one driving right next to it, would aim its main gun directly at its friend's turret. They would load a canister round and fire it right across the skin of the neighboring tank. Inside the tank, the American crew would hear the ting-ting of 300 steel pellets bouncing off their armor like heavy rain. But outside, the Japanese soldiers were instantly wiped away. The canister round sanded the enemy off the tank, leaving the steel hull clean and the Japanese infantry petrified with the realization that even touching the American machines meant instant death. The cave hunter on Okinawa, the Japanese lived inside a massive network of caves and limestone tunnels. They would pop out of a hole, fire a mortar, and disappear. The Sherman tanks became cave hunters. They would drive right up to the mouth of a tunnel. Instead of firing an explosive shell that might cause a cave-in, they would fire a 75mm canister round directly into the entrance. The steel pellets didn't just stop at the door. They would bounce off the stone walls, ricocheting deep into the darkness like a swarm of angry hornets. The Japanese soldiers inside weren't safe behind corners. The ricocheting steel found them everywhere. Japanese survivors spoke of the singing steel. They said the air would begin to hum with the sound of flying metal, and then everyone in the tunnel would simply fall. They were petrified because there was no way to hide. The Americans had turned the caves, the Japanese soldiers' only sanctuary, into a giant, stone-walled killing chamber. Petrified with terror, the loss of the Banzai, the sight of an American tank turret turning toward you became the ultimate symbol of doom. By the final months of the war, the Japanese Banzai charge had almost completely stopped. The reason was simple. The Japanese soldier knew that courage was no match for a canister round. They had seen their friends' men who had trained for years in hand-to-hand combat be turned into a red mist in half a second by a tank they couldn't even dent. This created a state of combat paralysis. Japanese commanders reported that their men would sometimes refuse to leave their foxholes when they heard the sound of American tank engines. They weren't afraid of the tank's armor. They were afraid of the cloud of steel that moved in front of it. The spirit of the samurai had been broken by the physics of the pellet, the final embrace of the steel. As the Americans pushed toward the heart of the Japanese Empire, the canister-equipped tank was the point of the spear. It allowed the infantry to move forward with the knowledge that the ground in front of them would be scoured clean. The one boom of the Sherman's gun was no longer just a sound of war. It was the sound of a closing door. It was the sound of the end of the Japanese infantry's dominance in the Pacific. The tanks weren't just armored vehicles anymore. They were the mobile shotguns that ensured the Banzai charge would never succeed again. The pellets were small, but the silence they left behind was deafening. Part 4. The Legacy of the Pellet. The war in the Pacific ended in a cloud of atomic fire, but for the infantrymen who survived the Banzai charges of Saipan and Okinawa, the most vivid memory wasn't the big bombs. It was the one boom of the canister round. It was the sound of 1,000 steel pellets turning a charging army into a memory. For decades after the war, the world thought the age of the giant shotgun was over. Tanks were getting bigger. Missiles were getting smarter. Military planners believed that future wars would be fought with laser-guided precision from miles away. But as the United States entered the urban battlefields of the 21st century, they realized that some problems can't be solved by a computer. Sometimes you don't need a scalpel. Sometimes you still need a sledgehammer. The wall of steel didn't die in 1945. It went into the shadows, waited, and returned in the form of the M1028 canister round. And just like their grandfathers in the jungle, modern enemies discovered that when an American tank points its barrel at you, there's nowhere left to hide. The return of the Predator. During the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, American tank crews faced a familiar problem. They were being attacked in narrow streets and dense urban killing zones by groups of insurgents. A high-explosive shell was too dangerous. It would blow up an entire building and kill everyone inside. A machine gun was too slow. The Americans needed a weapon that could clear the street in 1 second without destroying the city. The engineers went back to the history books. They looked at the 37mm gun from Bataan. They looked at the 75mm howitzer from Saipan. And they built the M1028. It is a 120mm canister shell designed specifically for the Abrams tank. Inside this modern tin can sit 1,100 heavy tungsten balls. Tungsten is nearly twice as dense as steel. It doesn't just hit you. It punches through you, through the brick wall behind you, and through the engine block of the truck parked down the street. The physics of absolute control. When an Abrams loader slams an M1028 into the breech, he is holding the equivalent of 1,000 snipers in one hand. When the gun fires, the tungsten balls leave the muzzle at a staggering speed of 4,600 feet per second. That is over 4 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the air itself becomes a weapon. The wall of steel now extends for 500 yards. A single shot can clear a path wider than a 4-lane highway. There is no leading the target. There is no missing. If the target is in front of the tank, the target ceases to exist. The Japanese soldiers of World War II were petrified by steel. Modern insurgents are petrified by tungsten. The result is the same: a total psychological collapse of anyone brave enough or foolish enough to stand in front of the king of armor. The shotgun effect in the 21st century. The modern canister round has a hidden advantage that the old ones didn't. It is hard surface optimized. In a modern city, the tungsten balls don't just stop when they hit a wall. They ricochet off the pavement, off the concrete, and off the steel of parked cars. This creates a hailstorm of metal that fills every doorway and every window. The enemy doesn't even have to be in the line of sight. If they are in the zone of effect, the bouncing tungsten will find them. This three-dimensional death is why modern infantry units are taught to never, under any circumstances, engage an Abrams tank from the front. The one boom today doesn't just clear a jungle trail. It clears an entire city block. It is the ultimate insurance policy for the American infantrymen. The final verdict. Why the terror endures. Why were the Japanese soldiers petrified? And why does that terror still exist today? It is because the canister round represents the ultimate industrialization of combat. It takes away the human element. It doesn't matter how well you have trained. It doesn't matter how many prayers you have said. It doesn't matter how much you believe in your cause. You cannot dodge 1,000 pellets. You cannot outrun a wall of tungsten. The wall of steel is the final word in any argument on the battlefield. It is the physical manifestation of American power, calculated, overwhelming, and impossible to stop. From the M2 gun in the mud of Guadalcanal to the Mana Rams in the dust of the desert, the legacy remains the same. The one boom is the warning, the pellets are the end. And the terror is the only thing that survives. The wall stands. And it always will. Part 5. The River of Blood. The date was August 21, 1942. The place was a small sandbar at the mouth of the Ilu River on the island of Guadalcanal. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, a man who believed that the Japanese spirit was a physical shield, led nearly 1,000 elite soldiers toward the American lines. They were the Ichiki Detachment. They had never lost a battle. They believed that the Americans were soft and that a single violent bayonet charge would send the Marines screaming back into the ocean. In the pitch-black darkness, the Japanese began their move. They didn't sneak. They didn't hide. They charged across the narrow sandbar, screaming Banzai, and waving their officers' swords. They expected to find a line of terrified boys. Instead, they found two 37mm anti-tank guns hidden in the sand, loaded with the very first batch of canister rounds to ever see combat in the Pacific. This was the moment the world changed. This was the night the spirit died. The sandbar slaughter as the Japanese soldiers crowded onto the narrow strip of sand. They became a target of opportunity that was too perfect to be true. They were packed together so tightly that they couldn't even swing their rifles. The Marine gunners waited. They waited until they could see the whites of the Japanese soldiers' eyes. They waited until the Banzai scream was loud enough to vibrate the metal of their guns. Then, they pulled the lanyards. One boom, 150 steel pellets. The first blast didn't just kill the men in the front row. It passed through them. The high-velocity pellets were so powerful that they traveled through 3 or 4 bodies before stopping. The sandbar, which had been white a second ago, was suddenly invisible under a layer of red. The Japanese soldiers behind them didn't stop. They couldn't see what was happening. They climbed over the piles of their own dead, only to meet the second wall of steel. The Marines were firing at a rate of 1 canister round every 6 seconds. The petrified survivors, by 3 o'clock in the morning, the Ilu River was literally choked with bodies. The Japanese soldiers who hadn't been hit were in a state of total catatonic shock. They had been trained for glorious death. They were prepared for a bullet to the heart or a blade to the chest. But they were not prepared to see an entire company of their brothers disappear in a single crack of a gun. One survivor later wrote that the air felt like it was made of invisible knives. He watched a man next to him be hit by 30 pellets at once. The man didn't even have time to fall, he was simply shredded where he stood. Those who survived the night were petrified. They hid in the water under the bodies of their friends, shaking with a terror that no amount of Bushido training could cure. They had seen the face of industrial war, and it was a machine that didn't care about their honor. The message to the Emperor, the Battle of the Tanaru, was a strategic earthquake. When the news of the Ichiki detachment's destruction reached the Japanese high command, they refused to believe it. They thought the Americans must have used secret poison gas or giant machines. They couldn't accept that a small 37mm gun and a handful of steel pellets had wiped out their most elite unit in less than an hour. But the reality was undeniable. The Banzai charge, the primary tactic of the Japanese Empire for 50 years, had met its match. The Americans had found the mathematical solution to the human wave. From that night on, every Japanese soldier who heard the one boom of a canister gun knew that he wasn't just facing a weapon, he was facing a wall of steel that nothing in his world could penetrate. The birth of a nightmare The legend of the giant shotgun began at the Tenaru. The Marines who fought that night realized they had a weapon that saved lives by ending charges instantly. They began to treat the 37mm gun with a kind of holy respect. It wasn't just an anti-tank gun anymore. It was the guardian of the foxhole. As we look back at the 1,000 steel pellets that crushed the Ichiki detachment, we see the beginning of the end for the Japanese Army's offensive spirit. The terror started on a sandbar in 1942, and it wouldn't end until the very last island was taken. The river ran red, the spirit was broken, and the steel remained. Part 6. The Price of Victory. The fires of the Pacific War have long since burned out. The jungles of Guadalcanal, Saipan, and Okinawa have reclaimed the rusted bones of the machines that once tore them apart. But if you walk those beaches today, you can still feel the weight of what happened there. We have talked about the physics of the 37mm gun. We have described the 1,000 tungsten balls of the modern Abrams. But the final story of the Wall of Steel isn't about metal. It is about the soul of warfare. The canister round didn't just win battles. It ended an entire philosophy of combat. It proved, once and for all, that in the modern age, the bravest heart is no match for the fastest machine. For the Japanese soldiers who faced it, it was a terror that petrified their very will to fight. For the American gunners who fired it, it was a memory that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This is the final verdict on the weapon that turned the tide of the Pacific. The burden of the gunner. We often talk about the terror of the Japanese infantry, but we rarely speak of the men behind the shield. The American artillerymen and tank crews who fired canister rounds were forced into a type of combat that was uniquely intimate and horrific. Unlike a pilot dropping a bomb from 30,000 feet, or a sailor firing a cruise missile from 50 miles away, the canister gunner saw exactly what his weapon did. Because the range was so short, often less than 50 yards, the gunner saw the faces of the men he was about to erase. Veterans of the 37th Infantry Division spoke of the red mist. They described the psychological toll of pulling a lanyard and watching a human wave simply disintegrate in front of them. It wasn't sniping, it was harvesting. Many of these men returned home with a silence that lasted for decades. They knew they had held the Wall of Steel, but they also knew the terrible price that steel had extracted. The death of the samurai spirit. For the Japanese Empire, the canister round was the great destroyer of their national myth. For centuries, the Japanese military had believed in Seishin, the idea that spiritual power and a sharp blade could overcome any material disadvantage. The Wall of Steel proved that Seishin was a lie. On islands like Iwo Jima, the Japanese soldiers stopped the grand Banzai charges. They stopped the screaming runs into the night. Why? Because the terror of the canister round had finally sunk in. They realized that charging an American line was no longer a glorious sacrifice. It was just a waste of life. They began to hide. They dug deeper into the volcanic rock. They turned into cave dwellers. The canister round forced the most aggressive army in the world to become a defensive, broken force. It petrified their offensive spirit so deeply that by 1945, the Banzai charge had become a relic of a dead era. The industrial shield, the Wall of Steel, was the ultimate expression of the American way of war. America didn't just bring soldiers to the Pacific. They brought an entire industrial civilization. While a Japanese craftsman might spend weeks hand-forging a single officer's sword, an American factory in Ohio was churning out 10,000 canister rounds a day. Each round was a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. This industrial shield is what saved the lives of countless American boys. Every time a canister round cleared a jungle trail or sanded a Japanese attacker off a tank, it meant that an American father, son, or brother was coming home. The price of victory was paid in steel pellets so that it wouldn't have to be paid in American lives. It was the victory of the factory over the sword. The final echo. The legacy of the canister round lives on today in the quiet respect that modern soldiers have for area denial weapons. We have learned the lesson of the Pacific. that the best way to prevent a charge is to make it physically impossible. The wall of steel remains a terrifying reminder of what happens when human courage meets industrial math. It is a story of terror, yes. It is a story of a giant shotgun that petrified an empire. But it is also a story of the terrible reality of survival. As we close this series, remember the one boom. Remember the scream of the pellets. And remember that in the dark jungles of 1942, it was a few inches of tin and 1,000 steel balls that stood between civilization and the void. The wall held, the guns are silent, but the lesson remains.